Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, we're going to get this set of videos finished, and tonight, this will be the end of my Beatles series. Now, for most people, the end of the Beatles was signaled with Yoko coming into the band and invading the band's personal space, and her always interfering in the band's decision. Well, many people don't realize because they don't read between the lines, or they have such a hatred for Yoko, which I don't like Yoko either. She was a gold digger, and she was a junkie who basically latched on to John in a codependent relationship and never let go, even after they kicked the heroin. But anyway, in 1969 to 1970, the Beatles were kind of pretty much done at that point. But the real cause of the Beatles breakup, in my opinion, was not Yoko or Alan Klein. It was actually John and Paul themselves, because they all wanted to top each other. They all wanted to write that perfect song. And when one would write the perfect song, the other would try to outdo him. And then one would outdo the other and outdo the other. And then finally, they started to snap each other. And when it came to business decisions, one had to top the other. And here's a brief history on the dynamic of the Beatles. In the early days, John was the leader. He was, the figurative leader, the one that made, within the band, the decisions. He made all of the rules, so to speak. But Paul would be in charge of the music because he was the better musician. This is how Brian Epstein wanted it. And it was a very genius idea because John did not need to be in charge of the music at all. He was a chaotic individual. Plus, he would do things in the studio that you shouldn't be doing in the studio. This is how John was. He was a natural exhibitionist and rule breaker. And Paul was the more stable person in the band. And so from then on, throughout their whole early career, when they toured from 63 to 66, was the way things were. Now, these tours could be hellish. I mean, at times, they had jelly beans thrown at them. They got their clothes pulled. Sometimes they could be physically assaulted like they were in the Philippines under the Marcos regime. I mean, that's how horrible it could get. And John, because we never look at this part of John, we never really see John as this guy that was mentally fragile, that he could snap at any moment. And I know it's going to sound mean, but John probably, within all of that time period, probably like in the 66 era after, during those tours, he probably mentally snapped. And that's what caused his huge drug intake. That's what caused his, bad decision making. Afterwards, he basically snapped from all of the stress from touring, from having to meet these deadlines, from having to create music and then having to tour, and then having to worry about being the perfect musicians that they were expected of being. Because guess what? John said that once they went on tour, once they toured for such a long period of time, their musicianship suffered. Oh yeah. And ultimately, the decision to make the Beatles a studio band was John's. Because Paul didn't want to stop touring. Paul believed that their music should be constantly promoted, constantly played, that they should constantly get out there. Because Paul loved the big crowds. He loved touring. He loved just celebrating the music with people. John loved that until he saw what had happened with all of these Beatles tours. I mean, come on. When you're, in his mind, when people try to throw things at you, when people try to grab your clothes or punch you or whatever, that was it. He no longer wanted to be a part of that. So he concentrated his energies on trying to create music for the studio. I mean, Paul did too, because Paul, believe it or not, could play multiple instruments, knew more about music than John did. I know that sounds disrespectful, but John did not like jazz. Paul loved jazz. John was not much for balladry. Paul loved balladry. So Paul was able to do all of those things. John wasn't. But when Paul had to create most of the music, that would piss John off, and so John would have to create his own songs and music. And this created the big rivalry between him and Paul. Now, in the early days, Paul did write a few songs, and one of those songs is Yesterday. And for a while, John was like, okay, that's cool, it's a brilliant song. And they could both collaborate on their music for the sake of the band. because him and John were the primary songwriters in the band. George barely wrote anything unless it was later in their careers, and Ringo barely wrote anything. Maybe one song in the Beatles. But for the most part, it was a Lennon-McCartney band. It was their songs, their compositions, their music in the band. And that's what sold. That's how things were. And it got to the point that when one person would make a brilliant song, one person had to make the better song. And so forth and so forth. It was a competition between John and Paul. These were huge ego battles. And they came to a head when it came to the Apple Records, debacle. They argued over whether the clothing aisles deserved to have sides or not. I mean, this is how stupid it got. Because one wanted to be in charge of the band, and the other, wanted to be as well. And they would both try to top each other. The Alan Klein vote was John's way of saying, hey, I'm in charge, as well as two other Beatles who were manipulated by John. And then bringing Yoko into the studio was John's way of telling Paul, I'm in charge here. People want to blame Yoko Ono for the decimation and the destruction of the band. She was the one that destroyed the band. Come on, no. I don't like Yoko either. I think she's a gold digger and a junkie and was in a codependent relationship and a possible sociopath who knew what she wanted. She wanted a Beatle. In fact, she told her ex-husband that she wanted a Beatle, and she was willing to go to Paul first, but Paul rejected her, so John took her in. Because he was a junkie and was, just whatever. John had issues. But that is what happened. This is how bad things got in the Beatles. Most people don't know because they listen to the albums and they worship the Beatles, but I see them as flawed human beings. John and Paul were both brilliant songwriters and musicians, but they were both over-competitive divas. That's the truth. They both wanted to top each other, to the point where they were willing to get back at each other by doing all of these stupid things to each other. And it was sad, but at the end of the day, it was they who ended the Beatles. And later, Paul admitted, much later, in fact, that John was the one that ended the Beatles. Finally, once and for all, he said, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm out. And that was the end of the Beatles as a songwriting partnership until they were able to legally get out of that, which was Paul's doing. So, at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, the Beatles ended because John and Paul wanted the Beatles to, well, not really, but, the Beatles ended because of John and Paul's egos and their own individual self-interests and their neglect of the band itself in order to further their egos, because they never bothered to realize that George was in the band and Ringo was in the band. I mean, it just became all about them and how they were getting back at each other and all of these ego battles, and it just was destructive. Now, they all had their solo careers, which is a great thing. Paul had a solo career and John had a solo career. And the one thing, and also George and Ringo did too, but the one thing that I noticed about John's solo work is that some of it was a bit banal and was very just basic, almost rockabilly stuff. It was almost what he would have sounded like if he would never been in the Beatles. If he would have quit the Beatles at one point and just decided to get a solo band. He would have just played mostly rockabilly sounding songs. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but that's what it sounded like. A lot of the solo stuff was more rockabilly-ish, kind of more, the chords weren't that, good. It was, I don't know, it's just, you'd have to listen to it. I love John Lennon's solo stuff, but not all of it was consistently good. It had an inconsistency problem. Paul's stuff, while brilliant, sometimes it leads itself to a little bit too poppy, too sugary. But it was brilliant because, unlike John, Paul could tell a cohesive story in his lyrics. He could spell out classical narratives from the third person perspective. And it was brilliant and beautiful. Paul had very beautiful lyrical structures in the songs. John did. John took a bunch of words and it was just pasted together. And it could be beautiful at times, but also at times it could be just, okay, John, you could do better. You're just being lazy. In fact, in the Beatles, John was just content at writing his lyrics and just going away. And Paul would be like, you can do better. No, I don't want to. However, John would be the one that would push Paul to do better stuff because he'd say, your stuff's saccharine, it's sugary, it's poppy. And so Paul would be like, okay, I can do better than you. And so he would, but then John would get mad and be like, I can do better than you. And then that's what triggered back and forth. And the solo hits prove that. Their own solo careers prove what kind of music they would have made outside the Beatles. So listen to those. It's good stuff, but that's what they would have sounded like if they would have quit the Beatles at an earlier point. Paul did love the rockabilly as well, but he also loved jazz. He loved rock and roll. He would have played more instruments, would have actually recruited himself a band, would have actually instructed them how to play, what notes to hit, because he's good at that. In fact, he did that with Wings, but he was kind of an asshole to Denny Lane, to be honest, because Denny Lane could also write songs and also had a very high and beautiful voice. But Denny could actually sing to him. Paul can't. Paul lost his voice. But anyway, this is going on a tangent. Anyway, I hope you love this series. Good night, and stay freaking awesome.